Sorry, did I scare you? And what I meant to say is AI. Don't click away. This is not a scary video. It's everywhere. AI in your toaster, AI in your toothbrush, AI in your games. AI is used in a lot of different ways, and it's often used to enhance the perceived performance of games. AI is used for stuff like texture compression, AI upscaling, and the most contentious one, frame generation. You have probably heard a lot of rumblings about frame generation, especially recently. Especially with the launch of the new green GPUs, everyone is saying how it's ugly or bad or whatever. But that's not entirely true. And this isn't cope. I have not bought a 50 series GPU. Like, I'm not coping here. The issue is that frame generation, along with a lot of other technology that is being pushed, are being used as crutches for optimizations rather than enhancers to already well-performing games. When the green guy says that the 5070 is similar in performance to a 4090, that was more confusing than anything, because frame generation is not a tool that can fill in a performance gap between two different classes of hardware. Also, I don't even think with frame generation it can even reach the same frame rate as the 4090. So what is frame generation then? Frame generation is basically a super complex algorithm that interpolates frames in games. Now that sounds bad, but in practice it's a lot better than it actually sounds, because this isn't your usual screw everything up interpolation that sucks and is bad and it sucks. The cool thing about frame generation in gaming is that it's first off trained off of a bunch of games, so it's better at interpolating objects and making it seem more clear. And second, since frame generation often has direct access to the game itself, it can use motion vectors to identify which part of the image is actually moving, so it can prioritize making generated frames in that section of the image look clearer. It's actually really cool. This way you can get a higher perceived frame rate while running on cheaper hardware, or you can crank the settings to a super high degree and still have a playable experience. Or that's at least how it should work. In reality, marketing is leaning on frame generation really hard to show off how powerful new hardware and software is, when in reality, it isn't. The thing is that frame gen, unfortunately, has a very, very big downside, and that's input latency. Even though your PC is telling you that super epic game with RTX on is running at 120 FPS, in reality, it's running at like 30 FPS with a 4 times frame generation modifier. While the end result might look fine, your inputs are still processed at that lower frame rate, which, despite making the image look good, still feels choppy. That's why when Green Man Group says that the 5070 was on the same level as the 4090 in terms of performance, while yes, it reaches those same perceived frame rates, it in fact feels a lot worse than what a real 4090 would be pushing in terms of performance. Plus, there's a lot of ghosting, smearing, and just so many downsides that become even more noticeable the lower your base frame rate gets. This has put frame generation in the bad feature category. The only time I see people actually recommend using frame gen is on like PC handhelds, where you kind of do need some of that frame gen to get anything looking even remotely pleasant sometimes. Frame generation isn't a bad technology though, it's just being used and marketed in the worst way possible. Companies are trying to push frame generation like it's the next DLSS. Imagine trying to sell sand as water. For those who aren't epic gamers, DLSS, or deep learning supersampling, was the first of these new AI technologies that were a way to boost performance in games when graphics weren't good enough. And I say AI in like quotation marks because like it's technically AI in the way that machine learning is AI, but they didn't want to call it AI because it's not. But now it is. DLSS basically allows the game to render at a lower resolution than the desired output resolution. And then that image would get upscaled using an algorithm so that it would look like it was native res. If you pixel peeped, you could still find issues, but for the most part, this was a welcome feature because the final product was close enough to looking near native. The reason why DLSS is actually seen as a good feature is that it actually gave you something that allowed for higher graphical settings and even ray tracing while increasing real frame rates. That real is in bold and it has like a lot, and I mean a lot of underlines underneath it. Higher frame rate means the game plays better, which means it feels better. These technologies are basically polar opposites, but are being pushed in the same way. DLSS fudges the numbers on the resolution side so that the frame rate can be better, while Framegen fudges the frame rate to make the image look better. Sometimes. But there is a better way. Framegen is actually really good if you have a game that is already running pretty well and you want to elevate it even further. If you aren't playing esports games, frame rate doesn't really matter after like 120 FPS, because the noticeable responsiveness of an image starts to diminish the higher you go. Not to say that it flat out stops decreasing latency, but it's so minor that for most games it doesn't matter at all. So let's say you have a game running at 60 or 90 FPS already. Adding in some Framegen on top of that to fill the gaps would be great. Not only do you get the better smoothness visually, but your keyboard and mouse still feel as responsive as they did before. The catch is that a lot of games cap the frame rate of the game when you enable Framegen. So no matter what you do, you can get stuck at a lower than desirable frame rate. And the tools for Framegen aren't easily accessible to the end user, unless you use something like lossless scaling. You might have heard about this app a while back. Tech reviewers were going feral over this thing. Lossless scaling is a paid app that you can get on Steam. It's pretty cheap already, but it often goes for sale for even cheaper. It's definitely worth the $3 I paid for it. This app has its own Framegen solution that is detached from the games you are playing, and it gives you, the user, the ability to dial in your own Framegen settings to get what is best for you. The best part is that you can also defer frame generation to a secondary GPU, so you no longer hog resources from the game to then Framegen the shit out of it. Your game can use all of your main GPU to run the best it possibly can, and then lossless scaling will add frames to that on its own separate hardware. This app opened my eyes to Framegen as a tool. In the past, I've used Framegen in games like Portal RTX and noticed all of the previous issues I've mentioned with it. I opted to just turn off the Framegen and lower the settings. I was a Framegen hater, now I'm a believer. I played Doom: The Dark Ages, maxed out graphics with DLSS quality on my 4070 Ti. Doing this gets me around 90 FPS, which is good, a little choppy on my high refresh rate display, but it feels really good latency-wise. Lossless Framegen can double that to perfectly match my monitor's refresh rate, and it looks perfect. Like, this and Spider-Man 2 legit are two games I use this all the time on. It's like magic. Lossless Framegen is so open to user modification that you can technically get over 1000 FPS by making your frame rate multiplier increase frame rate by a multiple of 20 times. There's legit no reason to ever do this, but it's funny that it even works at all. Now, some of you might have noticed I said something earlier, that this Framegen solution was detached from the game. And I also said modern Framegen solutions actually benefit from being integrated with games. The game and Framegen are no longer holding hands and kissing passionately. That's the big catch of all this. Lossless Framegen is best used with games already at high frame rates because it doesn't have access to the same features that other solutions have, like motion vectors. It's still a transformer model like the rest of them, aka it's been trained on a lot of stuff, but without motion vectors, if we lower the real frame rate to something that the other Framegen algorithms will set their games to, like 30 or 40 FPS, lossless Framegen looks messier in comparison since it doesn't get the same depth of information like DLSS would. Higher frame rates still have these same issues, but they pass by so much faster that this isn't a huge issue unless you're actively limiting your frame rate to produce these effects. We essentially need to go fast enough to pass by the mistakes quickly. It's also preferable to have a second GPU so you aren't using resources on the main GPU, otherwise you will be losing some real frames for the model to then interpolate between. So there is a price factor to all this. I already have a multi-GPU system because YouTuber moment, my workflow benefits from having multiple GPUs to render on. You think I'm real? You think you think all of this is real? You think I'm a real person? I'm gonna come get you. This can work on integrated graphics, but I wouldn't recommend it because the results can be pretty rough. Plus, it's not guaranteed that everyone has an APU on their desktop. It's all about the graphics card, baby. That's not to say that it doesn't have a use if you only have one GPU though. In fact, being detached from the game has its advantages because technically, you can frame gen anything. Hey guys, oh, don't mind me. I'm just running File Explorer at 2000 FPS. Being detached means that any app, any game can now run at a higher frame rate. And this is really important because some games actually could benefit from frame generation. If you have a game that is locked to a lower frame rate due to an engine restriction like with physics, this is the perfect tool because the game will visually look smoother while not impacting the functionality of the game. Plus, latency won't really be affected because the game is still running at its true original speed. Skylanders has a lot of its physics tied to the frame rate of the game, and when emulators can increase that frame rate, it also increases the speed of the physics in that game, causing some stuff to break. Framegen can increase that frame rate without breaking the game to do that. If you have a capture card, you could framegen your console games so that it looks smoother. And this is basically doing the exact same thing as a dual GPU setup I mentioned earlier, since there's a whole other device that is doing the main rendering. And that brings us to this. What if I told you that there was a way with Framegen to get a higher frame rate while also not increasing input latency? 3DS emulation has come a long way, but it still isn't perfect. There are audio issues and slowdowns sometimes, and most notably input latency issues. All emulators, especially 3D ones, have input latency problems. It's just a fact about how emulation works. No matter what you do, you will never get near native input latency on emulation because of all of the translation that's going on. Mario 3D Land is a game that struggles on 3DS emulators. That's not to say it doesn't run, but it isn't a perfect experience either, often having frame drops and some lag. You can up the frame rate from a native 30 to 60 FPS, but that doesn't solve the input latency issues. Retro Game Corps actually did a video on emulation with 3DS games and input latency, especially with this dual screen add-on that was releasing for some retro emulation handhelds. And he demonstrated that no matter what, emulators will always have more input delay than real consoles, around 21 milliseconds behind real hardware. With that in mind, I went ahead and used my capture card modded 3DS, plugged it into my PC, and framegen the capture. This is the world's first 60 FPS Super Mario 3D Land gameplay with the lowest possible input latency. This capture card only adds about a frame of latency between the real device and the output screen with the software I'm using. The overall latency is still 6 frames faster than an emulator could put out. For the first time ever, Framegen is faster than real rendering. So, are you a Framegen believer now? Okay, well, believer is a very strong word. This is still a lot of funky math doing fake frames, but do you get the idea? Framegen is just a tool. It shouldn't be a crux for making games better because if used wrong, it really does not make things better. If anything, it makes it worse. But using it as a supplement to already great games running pretty well is well worth it in my eyes. Go, make Space Pinball run at 800 FPS. We are able to achieve this now with modern technology. No one can stop you. Run it at 1000 FPS, or just double it to like 120. The game ran at like 30 originally, right? So now it's 4 times better. Or you can just play the game.